Oh, do come in. It seems we have another little puzzle on our hands, don't we?
The Christmas Sleigh Bell Killer. Welcome, dear listeners, to Velvet Clues. I'm Connor, your narrator for this evening's tale of mystery and murder most foul. Before we begin our journey into the dark heart of a Christmas crime, I'd like to ask you something. Do you remember the first time you heard sleigh bells ringing? Was it on a snowy December evening, or perhaps in an old Christmas film? Share your memories in the comments below. I always find it fascinating how certain sounds can transport us back to moments of innocence, before we learn that even the most festive symbols can become instruments of death. Now, settle in with your hot chocolate or mulled wine, and let's begin our story through the keen eyes of Miss Jane Marple. Chapter 1. The Collector's Fatal Exhibition. The Thornbury Christmas Antiques Exhibition had been a fixture of the festive season for nearly 40 years, transforming the Victorian grandeur of Thornbury Hall into a wonderland of historical treasures each December. Miss Jane Marple, having arrived early to avoid the crowds, moved through the displays with the measured pace of someone who understood that true observation required patience and attention to detail. The great hall glittered with Christmas decorations interwoven among the antique displays, creating an atmosphere that was both festive and reverent. Dealers from across England had gathered to showcase their finest pieces, from Georgian silver to Tudor tapestries, each item carrying its own story of centuries past. It was near the central display that Miss Marple first encountered Reginald Hartwell, though at that moment she had no notion of how significant this meeting would prove. He stood behind a magnificent collection of antique sleigh bells, their brass and silver surfaces gleaming under the carefully arranged spotlights. Mr. Hartwell was a man of perhaps 60 years, with the soft hands and careful manner of someone who had spent his life handling delicate objects rather than creating them. "Magnificent collection, Mr. Hartwell," remarked a gentleman standing nearby, whom Miss Marple recognized as Professor Thornton from the Regional Museum. "That Russian troika bell must be exceptionally rare." Hartwell's face lit with the enthusiasm of a true collector. "Indeed it is, Professor. Late 18th century from the workshops of St. Petersburg. The provenance is impeccable, traced through 3 noble families before arriving in England." Miss Marple observed this exchange with interest, noting the slight tension in Professor Thornton's jaw and the way his fingers drummed against his exhibition catalogue. There was history here, she sensed, beyond the mere appreciation of antique bells. As she moved closer to examine the displays, she couldn't help but overhear another conversation. A younger woman, elegantly dressed but with worry lines etched deeply around her eyes, was speaking urgently to Hartwell in lowered tones. "You cannot continue this charade." "Reginald," she hissed, "the Cambridge Authentication Committee is reviewing everything now. When they discover what you've done—" "My dear Margaret," Hartwell replied with a confidence that seemed somewhat forced, "you worry unnecessarily. My documentation is thorough, and my reputation speaks for itself." The woman, Margaret, shook her head in apparent frustration before walking away, nearly colliding with a tall, distinguished man whom Miss Marple recognized as Dr. Edmund Carstairs, the renowned antiquities expert who had recently been dismissed from the Victoria Museum under mysterious circumstances. "Dr. Carstairs," Hartwell called out, with what appeared to be genuine surprise. "I hadn't expected to see you here." The look Carstairs gave him could have frozen the wassail bowl at the refreshment stand. "I wouldn't have missed it for the world, Hartwell. We have unfinished business, you and I." The confrontation might have escalated, but at that moment, the exhibition coordinator announced the beginning of the special presentation on authentication techniques. The crowd began moving toward the lecture area, leaving Hartwell alone with his bells. Miss Marple lingered, pretending to study a nearby display of Victorian Christmas ornaments, while keeping Hartwell in her peripheral vision. She watched as he carefully polished a particularly ornate bell with a chamois cloth, his movements almost loving in their gentleness. Yet there was something in his expression, a mixture of pride and anxiety, that suggested a man guarding secrets. As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple noticed several other individuals who seemed to pay particular attention to Hartwell's display, each with their own air of barely concealed tension. The stage, it seemed, was being set for something more dramatic than a simple Christmas exhibition. Chapter 2. Blood Among the Silver Bells. The discovery of Reginald Hartwell's body came at precisely 4:30 on that grey December afternoon, when the exhibition hall had reached its peak attendance, and the sound of Christmas carols from the string quartet in the adjacent room provided an ironically cheerful backdrop to murder. Miss Marple had been examining a collection of Victorian prayer books when the scream pierced through the genteel murmur of conversation and the tinkling of teacups. Mrs. Patricia Fenwick, the exhibition coordinator, had gone to remind Hartwell that his scheduled authentication demonstration was about to begin. Instead, she found him sprawled behind his display table, his head bearing the unmistakable marks of repeated blows, and clutched in his right hand, covered in blood, was one of his most prized possessions, an 18th century Russian troika bell. Miss Marple arrived at the scene moments after Mrs. Fenwick's discovery, her progress through the gathering crowd aided by her appearance of harmless, elderly curiosity. What she observed in those first crucial moments would prove significant to understanding the entire tragic affair. Hartwell lay in an unnatural position, his body twisted as though he had tried to turn away from his attacker in his final moments. The blood had pooled beneath his head, seeping into the Persian rug that had been placed to add elegance to his display area. Most striking was the bell itself, its once gleaming surface now macabre with evidence of violence, yet still somehow beautiful in its antique craftsmanship. "Nobody touch anything," commanded a firm voice from the doorway. Inspector Patterson of the county police had arrived with admirable promptness, his presence immediately establishing order among the chaos. He was a man Miss Marple knew by reputation, methodical and thorough, though perhaps lacking in imagination when it came to the more subtle aspects of human nature. As the inspector began cordoning off the area, Miss Marple noticed several telling details that might easily be overlooked in the initial shock of discovery. There were what appeared to be watermarks on the display table, forming a rough circle as though a wet glass had been set down recently. Near Hartwell's left hand, partially hidden beneath his body, she glimpsed what looked like a fragment of paper with writing on it. "I need everyone who had any interaction with Mr. Hartwell today to remain in the building," Inspector Patterson announced. "This is now a crime scene, and no one is to leave without giving a statement." The crowd that had gathered began to disperse slowly, their shocked whispers creating a low hum of speculation. Miss Marple observed the reactions of those she had noticed earlier, showing particular interest in Hartwell's display. Professor Thornton stood near the windows, his face pale but composed, his hands clasped behind his back, in a pose that suggested he was trying very hard to appear calm. Margaret, the woman who had argued with Hartwell earlier, sat heavily in a chair someone had provided, her elegant composure completely shattered. Dr. Carstairs remained where he had been when the scream occurred, in the Tudor furniture section, his expression unreadable. "Did anyone see Mr. Hartwell after 3:45? Inspector Patterson asked the assembled group. Several hands rose tentatively. A dealer named Morrison mentioned seeing Hartwell polishing his bells around 4 o'clock. The tea lady recalled bringing him a cup of Earl Grey at 4:15, which he had accepted with his usual politeness. "He seemed nervous," the tea lady added, kept checking his pocket watch and looking toward the main entrance like he was expecting someone. Miss Marple filed this information away while continuing her discreet observation of the crime scene. The positioning of the body suggested that Hartwell had been facing his attacker initially, then had turned, perhaps to flee or to protect himself. The repeated blows indicated rage rather than calculation, yet the choice of weapon, one of Hartwell's own precious bells, seemed deliberately symbolic. "That particular bell," Professor Thornton said suddenly, his voice carrying across the hall, "was the centerpiece of his collection. He claimed it belonged to Tsar Alexander I's personal troika." Inspector Patterson turned his attention to the professor. "You seem very familiar with Mr. Hartwell's collection." "I should be," Thornton replied with barely concealed bitterness. "My museum paid £40,000 for 3 of his bells last year. We later discovered they were reproductions, manufactured in Birmingham 6 months ago." This revelation sent a ripple of shock through the remaining crowd. Miss Marple noticed how several other dealers exchanged meaningful glances, and she wondered how many others had fallen victim to Hartwell's deceptions. Chapter 3. Inspector Patterson's swift arrests. The drawing room of Thornbury Hall had been commandeered as a temporary interview room, its cheerful Christmas decorations providing an incongruous setting for police interrogations. Inspector Patterson had moved with impressive efficiency, gathering statements and evidence while the forensic team processed the scene of Hartwell's death. Miss Marple, having given her own brief statement, had managed to position herself where she could observe the comings and goings with minimal intrusion. By 6 o'clock, as the December darkness pressed against the windows and the remaining exhibitors huddled in worried clusters, Inspector Patterson emerged with an air of grim satisfaction. He had requested that all primary persons of interest gather in the main reception room, and Miss Marple noticed that this group consisted primarily of those she had observed earlier, showing particular animosity toward the deceased. "Ladies and gentlemen," the inspector began, his notebook prominently displayed, "our initial investigation has revealed some disturbing facts about Mr. Hartwell's business practices. It appears he has been systematically creating fraudulent provenances for reproduction antique bells, passing them off as genuine artifacts to museums and private collectors." Dr. Edmund Carstairs stepped forward, his face flushed with vindication. "I've been trying to expose him for 2 years. He sold the Victoria Museum a set of allegedly 17th century Dutch carillon bells. When I proved they were modern forgeries, the museum board blamed me for the embarrassment. I lost my position because of that charlatan." "Which gives you a very strong motive for murder, Dr. Carstairs," Patterson observed coolly. "You were heard threatening Mr. Hartwell just this afternoon." "Threatening to expose him to the Authentication Committee," Carstairs protested. "Not to bash his skull in with a Russian bell." Margaret Hartwell, for that was indeed her relation to the deceased, as Miss Marple had correctly surmised, spoke up with a trembling voice. "Inspector, my brother may have been foolish and greedy, but he didn't deserve this. Though I cannot pretend, surprised that his deceptions finally caught up with him." Patterson consulted his notes. "Miss Hartwell, you were observed arguing with your brother shortly before his death. You mentioned the Cambridge Authentication Committee. Were you aware of his fraudulent activities?" Margaret's shoulders sagged. "I discovered the truth 6 months ago when I found reproduction receipts in his study. I begged him to stop, to come clean before someone found out. But Reginald was convinced he could maintain the deception indefinitely. He said his reproductions were so perfect that even experts couldn't tell the difference." Professor Thornton interjected with considerable heat. "Perfect reproductions that cost my museum its credibility and nearly resulted in my dismissal. The board held me responsible for not detecting the fraud before the purchase." Miss Marple noticed that while everyone seemed eager to express their grievances against Hartwell, there was something rehearsed about their performances, as though each was playing a role they had prepared in advance. She also observed that young Timothy Bellwether, Hartwell's assistant, had remained silent throughout these exchanges, his face pale and his hands trembling slightly. Inspector Patterson apparently noticed this as well. "Mr. Bellwether, you've been very quiet. As Mr. Hartwell's assistant, surely you must have known about these fraudulent activities." The young man started as though awakened from a trance. I only helped with cataloguing and research. Mr. Hartwell handled all the authentication documents himself. He was very particular about that." "Yet you had access to his workshop, where these reproductions were allegedly created," Patterson pressed. "There was no workshop," Bellwether replied, confusion evident in his voice. "Mr. Hartwell obtained all his pieces through estate sales and private collections. At least that's what he told me." This statement caused a stir among the assembled group. If Hartwell hadn't been creating the reproductions himself, then who had been his supplier? Patterson made a note before continuing. "We've found evidence that Mr. Hartwell received a threatening letter yesterday, warning him that his deceptions would be exposed at this exhibition. The letter was signed, 'A Concerned Colleague.' Would anyone care to claim authorship?" The silence that followed was heavy with suspicion. Miss Marple observed how each person seemed to be assessing the others, calculating who might have sent such a warning. "Furthermore," Patterson added, "we've discovered that Mr. Hartwell's insurance policy on his bell collection was recently increased to £500,000, with his sister Margaret as the sole beneficiary." Margaret gasped. "I knew nothing about that. Reginald handled all his own financial affairs." "Nevertheless," Patterson said firmly, "the facts are suggestive. We have multiple people with strong motives, evidence of fraud that was about to be exposed, and valuable insurance policy. I'm afraid I must ask all of you to remain available for further questioning. No one is to leave the county without police permission." As the group began to disperse, Miss Marple overheard Dr. Carstairs mutter to Professor Thornton, "At least that's the end of his vile trade in forgeries." "Is it?" Thornton replied quietly. "What about all the fakes already in circulation? This scandal will destroy confidence in the entire antique bell market." Miss Marple reflected that while Inspector Patterson had efficiently identified the obvious suspects and motives, there remained something fundamentally unsatisfying about his approach. The murder weapon itself, that blood-stained Russian bell, seemed to mock their attempts at rationalization, holding secrets that mere facts and timelines couldn't reveal. Chapter 4. Secrets in the Bell Tower Workshop. The morning following Reginald Hartwell's murder dawned crisp and bright, with a light frost that made Thornbury Village sparkle like a scene from a Christmas card. Miss Marple, having spent a restless night pondering the peculiarities of the case, decided to pay a visit to St. Catherine's Church, where she had learned Hartwell had been a long-time member of the bell-ringing society. The church, with its Norman tower and Victorian additions, stood at the heart of the village, its bells silent now in respect for the deceased. Miss Marple found the vicar, Reverend Christopher Ashworth, in the vestry, sorting through papers with an air of distraction. "Ah, Miss Marple," he greeted her, his usually cheerful countenance subdued. "I suppose you've heard about poor Reginald, such a shock to our community." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, settling herself into a worn leather chair. "I understand Mr. Hartwell was quite devoted to your bell-ringing society." The vicar nodded thoughtfully. "For 20 years or more. He had a genuine passion for bells, you know, not just collecting them, but understanding their history, their manufacture, their voices. He could tell you the age and origin of a bell just by its tone." "How remarkable," Miss Marple observed. "Such expertise must have been invaluable in his antique business." "One would think so," the vicar replied, but his expression suggested uncertainty. "Though, lately I noticed he seemed troubled during our practice sessions. Distracted, anxious even. Last month he asked me about the moral implications of deception in business. Hypothetically, of course." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "And what did you tell him?" "That truth has a way of revealing itself, and that conscience is a burden that grows heavier with time." He didn't seem comforted by my response. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Walter Morrison, the church's elderly bell tower keeper, who had maintained the bells for over 40 years. "Begging your pardon, Vicar," Morrison said, his weathered face creased with concern, "but there's something you should know. I've been up in the tower workshop checking on some repairs, and I found something peculiar." The vicar and Miss Marple exchanged glances before following Morrison up the narrow spiral staircase to the bell tower. The workshop was a small room filled with tools, ropes, and spare parts for bell maintenance. Morrison led them to a dusty corner where several wooden crates were stacked. "These weren't here last week," he explained, pulling back a tarpaulin to reveal the crate's contents. Inside were bells, at least a dozen of them, of various sizes and apparent ages. But what caught Miss Marple's attention was the modern shipping label on one crate, partially torn but still legible, addressed to R. Hartwell from a foundry in Birmingham. "Good heavens," the vicar exclaimed. "What are these doing here?" Morrison scratched his head. "That's what I'd like to know." Mr. Hartwell had a key to the workshop, being a member of the bell-ringing society, but he never mentioned storing anything here. Miss Marple examined the bells carefully. To her untrained eye, they appeared genuinely antique, with appropriate patina and wear. Yet the shipping label told a different story. She noticed that each bell had a small paper tag attached with string, bearing dates and what appeared to be historical descriptions. "These tags," she observed, "appear to be in Mr. Hartwell's handwriting." The vicar peered closer. "You're right. This one claims to be from a monastery in Bavaria, dated 1743. But if it came from Birmingham last month—" "Then it's clearly a forgery," Morrison completed grimly. "No wonder he was so interested in our restoration techniques. He was learning how to age new bells artificially." Miss Marple noticed something else, a leather-bound notebook tucked between two crates. Opening it carefully, she found pages of meticulous notes in Hartwell's hand, describing various aging techniques using chemicals and controlled oxidation, methods for creating authentic-looking wear patterns, and even recipes for replicating the specific alloy compositions used in different historical periods. "This is quite damning," the vicar said sadly. "Poor Reginald was more deeply involved in deception than anyone imagined." "Yet," Miss Marple mused, "why would he keep such incriminating evidence here, in a place where any member of the bell-ringing society might discover it?" Morrison had a sudden thought. Perhaps he didn't expect to leave it here long. The Society's annual Christmas concert is tomorrow night. Maybe he planned to move them after the exhibition, when everyone would be distracted by the concert preparations. The vicar was studying the notebook more closely. "There's something else here. Look at these recent entries. He mentions a partner, someone he refers to only as S, someone who was pressuring him to increase production." Miss Marple carefully noted this information. A partner added an entirely new dimension to the case. If Hartwell had not been working alone, then his murder might have been motivated by something more than revenge for past frauds. "There's one more thing," Morrison said, leading them to another corner of the workshop. "I found this hidden behind the tool cabinet." He produced an ornate bell, clearly very old and valuable, with Cyrillic inscriptions around its rim. Miss Marple recognized it immediately as similar to the Russian troika bell that had been used to murder Hartwell. "But this can't be," the vicar said in amazement. "This looks exactly like the bell that was used." "Indeed," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "It appears Mr. Hartwell possessed two identical Russian bells. One wonders which was genuine and which was the reproduction." The implications of this discovery were profound. If the murder weapon had been a forgery, what had happened to the genuine bell? And more importantly, did the killer know which bell they had used to commit the crime? Chapter 5. A Curator's Desperate Confession. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows of Thornbury Hall's library, where Inspector Patterson had established his temporary headquarters. Miss Marple had just finished informing him of the morning's discoveries at St. Catherine's Church when Professor Thornton burst through the door, his usually composed demeanour completely shattered. "Inspector, I must speak with you immediately," he gasped, his face flushed and his breathing laboured, as though he had run the entire distance from the village. "I can no longer remain silent about what I know." Patterson gestured for the professor to sit, while Miss Marple quietly positioned herself where she could observe without seeming intrusive. Professor Thornton collapsed into a chair, running trembling fingers through his dishevelled hair. "I lied in my earlier statement," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I did see Hartwell after 4 o'clock yesterday. We met in the Tudor room, away from the crowds. I had to confront him one final time about the forgeries." Patterson leaned forward, his expression stern. "Professor Thornton, I must caution you that anything you say may be used as evidence. Perhaps you should have legal counsel present." Thornton waved dismissively. No, I must tell someone. The weight of it is unbearable. I went to Hartwell with proof, irrefutable proof that would have destroyed him completely." Miss Marple noticed how the professor's hands shook as he reached into his jacket pocket, producing a folded document. "This is a metallurgical analysis report from the University of Cambridge," he explained. "I had samples from 3 bells Hartwell sold to various museums tested without authorization. The alloy composition is entirely wrong for their supposed periods. The tin-to-copper ratios are modern, and there are trace elements that didn't appear in bell bronze until the 20th century." Patterson examined the document carefully. "This is dated 3 weeks ago. Why didn't you come forward immediately?" Thornton's face crumpled. "Because Hartwell threatened to reveal something about me that would have been equally destructive. You see, Inspector, 15 years ago, when I was a junior curator, I made a terrible mistake. I authenticated a collection of medieval manuscripts that turned out to be Victorian forgeries. The museum covered it up to avoid scandal, but Hartwell somehow discovered the truth." "So he was blackmailing you," Patterson stated rather than asked. "Not for money," Thornton clarified. "For silence. He knew I had suspicions about his bells, and he used my past mistake to ensure I wouldn't investigate too thoroughly. But when the Cambridge report arrived, I couldn't remain silent any longer. The integrity of multiple museums was at stake. Miss Marple spoke gently. "What happened when you confronted him yesterday, Professor?" Thornton turned to her, seeming to notice her presence for the first time. "He laughed, Miss Marple. Actually laughed. He said the report meant nothing because he had documents proving the bell's authenticity that would stand up to any scrutiny. He claimed he had been set up by someone who wanted to destroy his reputation." "Set up?" Patterson interjected skeptically. "By whom?" "He wouldn't say, but he did mention that he had discovered who his real enemy was, someone who had been using him as a front for their own criminal activities. He said he had evidence hidden away that would expose everything." Patterson made rapid notes. "Did he say where this evidence was hidden?" "No." He became very agitated, kept looking at his pocket watch. "He said he had to prepare for his demonstration, and that after tonight, everything would be different. Those were his exact words. After tonight, the truth will ring out as clear as a bell." Miss Marple found this phrase particularly intriguing, given Hartwell's involvement with the bell-ringing society. Thornton continued, his voice growing more desperate. "I left him there, alive and determined to expose someone. But, Inspector, I swear I didn't kill him. When I heard the scream and learned he was dead, my first thought was that whoever he planned to expose had silenced him first." Patterson studied the professor carefully. "You realize this confession places you at the scene shortly before the murder. Your motive remains strong, and now we know you had opportunity. But I also had the most to gain from Hartwell remaining alive," Thornton protested. "If he really did have evidence of being set up, it might have exonerated my museum from the scandal of purchasing forgeries. His death leaves us with nothing but questions and damaged reputations." Miss Marple noticed that Thornton's argument, while logical, seemed to cause Inspector Patterson some consternation. The inspector had been building a case based on straightforward revenge motives, but this new information suggested a more complex web of deception. "Professor," Miss Marple asked quietly, "did Mr. Hartwell mention anything about a partner? Someone he referred to as S?" Thornton looked startled. "How did you—" "Yes, actually. He made an odd comment about how S would regret underestimating him. I assumed he was referring to Dr. Carstairs, whose first name is Stephen." Patterson immediately seized on this. Dr. Stephen Carstairs. Of course. He had the expertise to identify forgeries, which means he also had the knowledge to create them. "But that makes no sense," Thornton objected. "Carstairs has been the most vocal opponent of Hartwell's frauds. His entire campaign has been about exposing fake antiquities." "Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested mildly. "That was precisely the point. What better cover for a forger than to position oneself as a crusader against forgery?" The implications of this observation settled over the room like a winter chill. If Carstairs had been Hartwell's partner, supplying the forgeries while simultaneously building a reputation as an authentication expert, it would represent a deception of breathtaking audacity. Patterson stood abruptly. "Professor Thornton, I'm placing you under arrest on suspicion of murder. You had means, motive, and by your own admission, opportunity." As the professor was led away, his protests echoing through the hallway, Miss Marple remained seated, troubled by the feeling that they were still missing crucial pieces of the puzzle. The mysterious S, the hidden evidence Hartwell had mentioned, and the significance of the duplicate Russian bells all suggested that the truth was more complex than even Professor Thornton's confession revealed. Chapter 6. The Birmingham Foundry Connection. The next morning brought an unexpected development when Sergeant Mills arrived at Thornbury Hall with a telegram from Birmingham. Inspector Patterson read it with growing interest before sharing its contents with Miss Marple, who had arrived early to examine the evidence room once more. "The Birmingham police have been most helpful," Patterson announced. "They've identified the foundry that shipped those bells to Hartwell. It's a small operation run by a Samuel Blackwood, who specializes in historical reproductions for museums and theatrical productions." Miss Marple's eyes brightened with interest. "Samuel Blackwood. The initial S, perhaps?" "My thoughts exactly," Patterson agreed. "I've arranged for Mr. Blackwood to be brought here for questioning. He should arrive within the hour." While they waited, Miss Marple studied the murdered man's personal effects, which had been catalogued and laid out on a long table. Among the usual items, wallet, keys, pocket watch, she noticed something peculiar. Hartwell's appointment diary showed an entry for the evening of his death. 8 p.m, final settlement with S.B. Samuel Blackwood, Patterson said, reading over her shoulder. This grows more damning by the moment. Timothy Bellwether, Hartwell's assistant, had been summoned to help identify some of the items. The young man still appeared shaken by recent events, his nervous manner even more pronounced than before. "Mr. Bellwether," Miss Marple asked gently, "did Mr. Hartwell ever mention anyone with the initials S.B.? Timothy thought carefully. There was Mr. Blackwood who called occasionally. Mr. Hartwell always took those calls in private. I assumed he was a supplier, but Mr. Hartwell never introduced us." "Did you ever handle shipments from Birmingham?" Patterson inquired. "Several times," Timothy confirmed, "but Mr. Hartwell always insisted on unpacking them himself. He said the items were too delicate for anyone else to handle." At that moment Sergeant Mills returned, escorting a small, wiry man with intelligent eyes and calloused hands that spoke of manual labour. Samuel Blackwood looked more like a craftsman than a criminal, though Miss Marple had learned long ago that appearances could be thoroughly deceptive. "Mr. Blackwood," Patterson began formally, "thank you for coming. We have some questions about your business relationship with Reginald Hartwell." Blackwood's expression was wary but not hostile. "I heard about his death. Shocking business, but I don't see how I can help. I'm just a foundry owner who makes reproduction bells for legitimate purposes." "Yet you supplied Mr. Hartwell with bells that he passed off as genuine antiques," Patterson stated bluntly. Blackwood's face flushed with indignation. "That's a lie. Every bell I sold him was clearly marked as a reproduction. I stamp Repro on the inside of each one, along with my foundry mark and the year of manufacture. It's required by law." Miss Marple leaned forward. "Mr. Blackwood, would you examine this bell?" She indicated the murder weapon, still sealed in an evidence bag. Blackwood studied it carefully through the plastic. "That's one of mine, all right. Made it 6 months ago. See that pattern on the crown? That's my signature design. But if you look inside, you'll find my marks." Patterson carefully unsealed the bag and allowed Blackwood to examine the bell's interior with gloved hands. The foundry owner's expression changed from confidence to confusion. "The marks have been ground off," he said slowly. "Someone's used acid or abrasive tools to remove them. This is deliberate falsification." "Are you suggesting Mr. Hartwell modified your reproductions?" Patterson asked. "Someone did," Blackwood replied firmly. "And it wasn't with my knowledge or consent. I've built my reputation on honest reproductions for educational purposes. If Hartwell was removing my marks and passing these off as originals, he was defrauding both his customers and me." Timothy Bellwether suddenly spoke up. "There's a grinding wheel in the workshop behind Mr. Hartwell's shop. He said it was for restoration work." This revelation caused Patterson to reassess the situation. If Blackwood was telling the truth, and his shocked expression suggested he was, then Hartwell had been the sole architect of the forgery scheme, at least initially. "Mr. Blackwood," Miss Marple asked, "did Mr. Hartwell owe you money?" The foundry owner's expression darkened. £3,000 for the last shipment. He kept promising to pay, but always had excuses. That's why I was planning to see him at the exhibition." "You were at Thornbury Hall yesterday?" Patterson demanded sharply. "I arrived at 4:30, just as that woman started screaming. Never even got to speak to him." Patterson made a note. "Can anyone verify your arrival time?" "The parking attendant. I had to argue with him about a space. Took 5 minutes to sort out." Miss Marple observed that Blackwood seemed genuinely distressed by the situation. His anger appeared directed more at the damage to his professional reputation than at the money owed. "Mr. Blackwood," she said thoughtfully, "did anyone else know about your arrangement with Mr. Hartwell?" Blackwood hesitated. "Well, there was that woman who came to my foundry last month. Said she was Hartwell's business associate, Stephen something." "Stephen?" Patterson asked urgently. "Are you certain it was Stephen?" "No. Wait," Blackwood corrected himself. Stephanie Carstairs. Said she was handling Hartwell's accounts while he was travelling." The room fell silent as the implications of this revelation sank in. Dr. Stephen Carstairs had a daughter, or perhaps a sister, named Stephanie. The mysterious S might not have been who they assumed. Patterson immediately dispatched Sergeant Mills to investigate this new lead, while questioning of Blackwood continued. Miss Marple, however, found herself pondering another puzzle. If the bell used to kill Hartwell was indeed a marked reproduction with the identifying stamps removed, what had become of the genuine Russian troika bell that had supposedly been the pride of his collection? Chapter 7. The Second Bell's Dark Purpose. The discovery of Stephanie Carstairs proved easier than anticipated. She was found at the White Hart Inn in Thornbury Village, having registered under her own name the day before the murder. When brought to the police station for questioning that afternoon, she presented a stark contrast to her father. Where Dr. Stephen Carstairs was tall and austere, Stephanie was petite and vivacious, with shrewd green eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "Miss Carstairs," Inspector Patterson began, his tone formal but not unkind, "we need to ask you about your relationship with Reginald Hartwell." Stephanie raised an elegantly shaped eyebrow. "Relationship? Inspector, I think you're rather overstating matters. I conducted some business with Mr. Hartwell on behalf of my father." Miss Marple, observing from her corner, noticed the slight tension in Stephanie's jaw when she mentioned her father. There was something there, some family dynamic that bore examination. "What sort of business?" Patterson pressed. "My father, as you know, has been investigating fraudulent antiques for years. I have a degree in metallurgy from Cambridge, and he asked me to help analyse some bells that Hartwell had sold to various institutions. Yet you visited Samuel Blackwood's foundry, claiming to be Hartwell's business associate," Patterson pointed out. Stephanie's composure flickered momentarily. "That was investigative work. I needed to understand the supply chain to trace how the forgeries were being produced and distributed." "Without informing the authorities?" Patterson's scepticism was evident. "My father preferred to build an ironclad case before making accusations. His own reputation had been damaged by Hartwell's deceptions. We needed absolute proof." Miss Marple spoke for the first time. "Miss Carstairs, when you visited Mr. Blackwood's foundry, did you place an order?" The question seemed to catch Stephanie off guard. Why would I do that?" "The foundry records show an order for a specific bell," Miss Marple continued, producing a paper that Sergeant Mills had obtained. "A Russian troika bell, matching exact specifications provided by someone signing themselves S. Carstairs." The colour drained from Stephanie's face. "That's not possible. I never—" "The specifications," Miss Marple continued gently but inexorably, "match precisely the bell that was used to murder Mr. Hartwell." The room fell silent except for the ticking of the station clock. Stephanie's hands clenched and unclenched in her lap as she struggled with some internal decision. "All right," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "I did order the bell, but not for the reason you think." Patterson leaned forward. "Then explain, Miss Carstairs. Explain why you ordered a replica of the very weapon used to kill Reginald Hartwell." Stephanie drew a shaky breath. "My father's obsession with Hartwell was destroying him. He talked of nothing else, spent every penny we had on investigations and analyses. I thought if I could prove definitively that Hartwell was selling forgeries, it would end this nightmare." "So you ordered a replica?" Patterson asked, confused. "I plan to switch it with Hartwell's genuine bell at the exhibition, then reveal the switch publicly, proving he couldn't tell the difference between his own supposedly authentic pieces and modern forgeries. It would have destroyed his credibility completely." Miss Marple studied the young woman carefully. "But something went wrong with your plan." Stephanie nodded miserably. "When I arrived at the exhibition, I discovered someone had already switched the bells. The genuine troika bell was gone, and in its place was a reproduction, though not the one I had ordered." "How could you tell?" Patterson demanded. "Because the one I ordered had a tiny mark I requested, a microscopic SC etched inside the crown. The bell on display didn't have it." Miss Marple's mind raced through the implications. If Stephanie's bell wasn't the one on display, and wasn't the murder weapon, then where was it? And more importantly, who had made the first switch? "Miss Carstairs," she asked carefully, "what time did you attempt this switch?" "I never got the chance. I went to Hartwell's display at about 3:45, but he was talking with that museum professor, Thornton. I decided to wait until the authentication demonstration when everyone would be distracted. But Mr. Hartwell was killed before the demonstration, Patterson noted. Yes, Stephanie said quietly. And when I heard he'd been killed with the Russian bell, I panicked. I thought somehow my replica had been used, that I would be blamed. Patterson stood abruptly. Miss Carstairs, I'm arresting you on suspicion of conspiracy to commit fraud. You admit to planning to switch the bells, you had access to the murder weapon, and you were present at the scene. As Stephanie was led away, protesting her innocence, Miss Marple remained troubled. The multiplication of bells, genuine Blackwoods reproductions, Stephanie's special order, created a confusion that seemed almost deliberately orchestrated. Inspector, she said thoughtfully, we now have at least 3 Russian troika bells in play. The original, Stephanie's marked replica, and the murder weapon. But what if there were even more? Patterson looked exhausted. More bells? Miss Marple, this case is already too complicated. Perhaps, Miss Marple mused. That's exactly the point. Someone wanted to create confusion, to muddy the waters so thoroughly that the real motive for murder would be lost in a maze of forgeries and switched bells. She thought of the bell in the church tower workshop, identical to the murder weapon. How many bells had there been? And more importantly, who had kept track of which was which? The answer, she suspected, lay not in the bells themselves, but in understanding who benefited most from the confusion surrounding them. The murder of Reginald Hartwell was beginning to look less like a crime of passion and more like the culmination of an elaborate deception that had spiraled beyond anyone's control. Chapter 8. Murder's Shadow at Evensong. The bells of St. Catherine's Church rang out for evensong on the day before Christmas Eve, their bronze voices carrying across the frost-covered village, with a clarity that made Miss Marple pause in her walk toward the church. There was something about the sound that troubled her, a subtle discord in what should have been perfect harmony. Inside the church she found an unexpected gathering. Despite the ongoing police investigation, or perhaps because of it, many of the principal figures in the Hartwell case had sought refuge in the ancient sanctuary. Dr. Stephen Carstairs sat rigid in a rear pew, his face a mask of controlled fury over his daughter's arrest. Margaret Hartwell knelt in private prayer near the altar, dressed in mourning black. Even Timothy Bellwether was present, nervously clutching a hymnal. The Reverend Ashworth conducted the service with his usual gentle authority, but Miss Marple noticed his eyes frequently straying to his congregants with concern. When the service concluded and the worshippers began to disperse, he approached her with evident relief. "Miss Marple, I'm so glad you're here. There's something I must tell you. Walter Morrison has discovered something else in the bell tower, something quite disturbing." They climbed the narrow stairs once more, finding Morrison waiting in the workshop with an expression of deep unease. The elderly bell-keeper had arranged several items on the workbench, including what appeared to be fragments of metal and several small glass vials. "I found these hidden behind the bell frames," Morrison explained. "I was checking the bearings when I noticed a loose board. These were concealed behind it." Miss Marple examined the items carefully. The metal fragments appeared to be pieces of bell bronze, showing signs of deliberate fracturing. The vials contained various liquids and powders, some labelled in Hartwell's distinctive handwriting. "Potassium permanganate, nitric acid, ferrous sulfate," she read aloud. "These are aging agents, aren't they?" Morrison nodded grimly. "Exactly what you'd need to make new bronze look centuries old, but that's not the worst of it." He produced a leather journal, its pages yellowed and worn. "This appears to be Mr. Hartwell's real record of his activities." Miss Marple opened the journal carefully, her eyes widening as she read. The entries went back nearly 5 years, detailing an elaborate scheme that was far more complex than anyone had imagined. Hartwell hadn't simply been selling forgeries, he had been systematically replacing genuine antique bells in churches and private collections with reproductions, then selling the originals abroad. "Dear heavens," the vicar breathed, reading over her shoulder. "He even replaced our own sanctuary bell last year. I thought it sounded different. but Hartwell assured me it was just the weather affecting the tone. One entry particularly caught Miss Marple's attention, dated just a week before Hartwell's death. The game is nearly up. S knows about the switches, threatens exposure unless I cut them in as full partner. But I have insurance. The genuine Troika bell is hidden where no one will think to look. If anything happens to me, the truth will ring out at Christmas. I've made sure of that. The truth will ring out, Miss Marple repeated softly. He used that same phrase with Professor Thornton. Morrison suddenly went very pale. The Christmas concert, he said urgently. Tomorrow night, we're performing a full peal on all 8 bells, if Hartwell did something to one of them. They hurried to examine the bells in the main tower. Morrison checked each one with practiced efficiency, his face growing increasingly concerned as he progressed. This one, he said, indicating the tenor bell. It's been tampered with. Look, the clapper has been modified, and there's something attached inside the sound bow. With considerable effort, they managed to position themselves to see inside the great bell. Secured with wire was a small package wrapped in oilcloth. Morrison carefully retrieved it, his hands shaking slightly as he unwrapped it. Inside was the genuine Russian Troika bell, the original that had started the entire deadly chain of events. But more importantly, there was a sealed envelope addressed, "To be opened in the event of my death." Miss Marple opened it with the vicar and Morrison as witnesses. Hartwell's handwriting filled several pages, revealing the full extent of his crimes, and crucially, the identity of his blackmailer. It wasn't any S at all, she said, with dawning understanding. The S stood for sister. Margaret Hartwell had discovered his scheme, and was forcing him to include her, or face exposure. The vicar gasped. Margaret! But she seemed so distressed by his death. Perhaps because she never intended it to go that far, Miss Marple suggested. Blackmail is one thing, but murder. Morrison had been examining the modified clapper more closely. There's something else here, he said. A maker's mark on the modification. M.H. Margaret Hartwell did this work herself. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with shocking rapidity. Margaret Hartwell, portrayed as the concerned sister, had been deeply involved in her brother's criminal enterprise. But had she also been his killer? We must inform Inspector Patterson immediately, the vicar said. But Miss Marple raised a cautioning hand. First, let's consider what else these discoveries tell us. If Margaret knew where the genuine bell was hidden, why didn't she retrieve it after her brother's death? Unless she doesn't know he hid it here, Morrison completed. She might have been searching for it, thinking it was worth a fortune. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. And if she killed him in a rage when he refused to tell her where it was, she's been desperately trying to find it ever since. The church bells suddenly began to chime the hour, their bronze voices seeming to carry an ominous warning. Tomorrow's Christmas concert would bring the entire community together, including Margaret Hartwell, who would undoubtedly attend as the grieving sister of a murdered man. We must ensure the concert proceeds without incident, Miss Marple said firmly. But we also must be prepared for the possibility that the killer, faced with the exposure of their crimes, might take desperate action. As they descended from the bell tower, Miss Marple reflected that the case had taken on the quality of a theatrical performance, with hidden props, false identities, and a denouement that promised to be as dramatic as it was revealing. Chapter 9. Gathering for the fatal concert. The afternoon of Christmas Eve arrived with a light snowfall that transformed Thornbury into a picture-perfect English village. St. Catherine's Church had been decorated for the evening's concert, with holly and ivy wound around the pillars and hundreds of candles ready to be lit for the performance. The irony was not lost on Miss Marple that such a festive setting would serve as the stage for the final act of their murder investigation. Inspector Patterson had been thoroughly briefed on the discoveries in the bell tower and had stationed plainclothes officers strategically throughout the church. Margaret Hartwell remained under covert surveillance, though she appeared to suspect nothing, maintaining her role as the grieving sister with convincing dedication. As the congregation began to gather for the concert, Miss Marple positioned herself where she could observe all the principal players in the drama. Professor Thornton had been released on bail and sat with his family, his relief palpable but tinged with lingering anxiety. Dr. Stephen Carstairs attended alone, his daughter still in custody despite her protestations of innocence. Timothy Bellwether had volunteered to help with the concert arrangements, perhaps seeking redemption through service. Margaret Hartwell arrived precisely at 7, dressed in elegant black that managed to suggest both mourning and celebration. She took her seat in the Hartwell family pew, the same one her brother had occupied for 20 years of Christmas concerts. The Reverend Ashworth opened the evening with a brief memorial for Reginald Hartwell, speaking of forgiveness and redemption in a way that made several people shift uncomfortably in their seats. Then Walter Morrison and the bell ringers took their positions, ready to perform the traditional Christmas peal. It was as the bells began their ancient rhythm that Miss Marple noticed something curious. Margaret Hartwell had gone very pale and was gripping the pew in front of her with white knuckles. Her eyes were fixed on the bell tower entrance, and there was something in her expression that spoke of terrible anticipation. The bells rang out in their mathematical sequence, but as they reached the point where the tenor bell would sound, Morrison had arranged for it to remain silent, the modified clapper having been disabled. The omission was jarring, creating a gap in the expected pattern that caused murmurs throughout the congregation. Margaret Hartwell stood abruptly, her composure finally cracking. She moved toward the tower entrance but found her path blocked by Inspector Patterson. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said formally, "I think you have some explaining to do." "I don't understand," she protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "The bells. Something's wrong with the bells." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, rising from her seat. "You expected something to happen when the tenor bell rang, didn't you? Something you had arranged to occur during the concert, perhaps to destroy evidence or create a distraction." Margaret's facade crumbled entirely. "You don't understand," she said desperately. "I never meant for Reginald to die. It was supposed to be simple." The congregation had fallen completely silent, all attention focused on the unfolding drama. "Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested gently, "you should tell us what really happened." Margaret sank into a pew, her shoulders shaking. "I discovered Reginald's scheme 2 years ago. At first, I was horrified, but then I realized the potential. We could make a fortune replacing bells all over the country, selling the originals to private collectors in America and Asia who didn't care about provenance." "So, you became partners," Patterson said. "More than partners. I improved his techniques, found better ways to age the reproductions. I have a chemistry degree, you see, though I never used it professionally. But Reginald grew greedy, started taking unnecessary risks. When that professor started investigating, I told him to return the money, claim it was all a mistake, but he refused." "And the murder?" Patterson pressed. Margaret's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "He was going to expose everything at the exhibition. He said he was tired of living a lie, that he would confess publicly during his demonstration. It would have ruined us both. I went to reason with him, but he laughed at me, said I was weak, that I didn't have the courage to stop him." She paused, her hands clenching and unclenching. The Russian bell was there on his display table. He turned his back on me, dismissing me like I was nothing. I don't remember picking it up, but suddenly it was in my hand, heavy and cold. The first blow was almost accidental, but then you had to make sure he couldn't survive to tell the truth," Miss Marple completed softly. "I panicked afterward," Margaret continued. "I tried to make it look like someone else had done it, left false trails. That silver nitrate on the floor was from my chemistry supplies. I even planted evidence to implicate others, but I couldn't find the genuine Russian bell. Reginald had hidden it somewhere, and it was worth £50,000 to the right buyer." "So you modified the tenor bell here, hoping to retrieve it during the concert," Morrison said with disgust. "You would have damaged our bells for your greed." Margaret looked up at him with hollow eyes. What did it matter? They're already forgeries anyway. Reginald replaced half the bells in the county with his reproductions. Your precious traditions are built on lies. The revelation sent shockwaves through the congregation. The Reverend Ashworth stepped forward, his face grave but compassionate. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "but faith and community are not forgeries, Mrs. Hartwell. They remain genuine regardless of the metal that calls us to worship." Inspector Patterson formally arrested Margaret Hartwell for the murder of her brother, while Stephanie Carstairs was released with apologies. As Margaret was led away, she turned back one final time. "Check every bell in every church," she said bitterly. "You'll find Reginald's mark on half of them. He may be dead, but his forgeries will ring on for generations." Chapter 10. Miss Marple's Christmas Resolution. Christmas morning dawned bright and clear over Thornbury village, the overnight snow having covered the landscape in pristine white that seemed to offer the promise of new beginnings. Miss Marple sat in the vicarage parlour, sharing tea with Reverend Ashworth, Walter Morrison, and somewhat surprisingly Timothy Bellwether, who had asked specifically to speak with her. "I need to tell someone the complete truth," Timothy began, his young face earnest and troubled. "With everything that's happened, I can't carry this burden any more." Miss Marple studied him with her characteristic blend of kindness and shrewd assessment. "I rather thought there was more to your story, Mr. Bellwether." Timothy nodded miserably. "I knew about some of Mr. Hartwell's activities. Not the murders, never that, but I suspected the forgeries. You see, I studied art history at university, specialised in medieval metalwork. When I saw some of his authentication documents, I recognised that the language was too modern, the technical descriptions anachronistic." "Yet you said nothing," the vicar observed, though his tone was more sad than accusatory. "He was giving me a chance," Timothy explained. "I had no experience, no connections, but he hired me anyway. I thought if I could slowly influence him, perhaps convince him to stop. I was naive." Morrison, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "The bells throughout the county, are they really all forgeries, as Margaret claimed?" Miss Marple set down her teacup thoughtfully. "I rather suspect that was an exaggeration born of anger. From the journal we found, it appears Reginald had replaced perhaps a dozen bells in total. Significant, certainly, but not the wholesale destruction of heritage that Margaret implied." "But how can we know which are genuine and which are false?" the vicar asked. "Interestingly," Miss Marple replied, "Mr. Blackwood, the foundry owner, has offered his expertise. He can identify his own work, and more importantly, he's willing to properly mark any forgeries that are discovered, allowing churches to keep them if they wish, but with full knowledge of their true nature." Timothy leaned forward. "I want to help with that project. I have all of Mr. Hartwell's private records, the ones he kept hidden even from Margaret. I know which bells were switched and where the originals were sold. Some might even be recoverable." The vicar smiled for the first time since the whole affair began. Good can come from evil, it seems. This tragedy might lead to a proper cataloguing and authentication of church bells throughout the region. Miss Marple nodded approvingly. "And Professor Thornton has proposed establishing a proper authentication committee, one that will help prevent such frauds in the future." There was a knock at the door, and Inspector Patterson entered, looking somewhat sheepish. "Miss Marple, I owe you an apology. If you hadn't persisted in investigating those bells in the tower, we might never have uncovered the full truth." "Nonsense, Inspector," Miss Marple replied graciously. "You were following the evidence as you saw it. The multiplication of bells and suspects would have confused anyone." Patterson pulled out a chair and joined them. "Margaret Hartwell has made a full confession. She's provided details of all the forgeries, the international buyers, even the offshore accounts where the proceeds were hidden. It's quite an extensive operation they were running." "What will happen to her?" Timothy asked quietly. "She'll likely face life imprisonment for murder, plus additional charges for fraud," Patterson replied, "though her cooperation might lead to some leniency." The church bells began to ring for Christmas morning service, their bronze voices calling the faithful to worship. Morrison listened with a critical ear, then smiled. "They sound different now," he said, knowing that some might be forgeries, yet they still ring true, still call us together. "Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested, "that's the real lesson here. The value of traditions lies not merely in their age or authenticity, but in their continued meaning for the community. A reproduction bell that calls people to worship for decades becomes sacred through use, not through its provenance." Reverend Ashworth raised his teacup in a gentle toast. "To truth revealed, justice served, and community preserved." As they prepared to leave for the Christmas service, Miss Marple noticed Stephanie Carstairs approaching the church with her father. The young woman caught her eye and nodded gratefully. Dr. Carstairs himself looked years younger, the burden of his obsession finally lifted. "Miss Marple," Stephanie said, approaching her outside the church, "I wanted to thank you for believing that not everyone involved was guilty of murder." "My dear," Miss Marple replied, "in my experience, the guilty often proclaim innocence the loudest, while the innocent sometimes remain troublingly silent. You were caught in a web not of your making, trying to help your father in the only way you knew how." The church was packed for the Christmas service, the community coming together despite, or perhaps because of, the recent tragedy. As the service began, Miss Marple reflected on the case that had started with a single death and revealed a network of deception spanning years. The bells rang out across Thornbury village, some genuine, some perhaps forgeries, but all united in their purpose. And in that unity, Miss Marple found a kind of truth that transcended the mere facts of the case. Dear listeners of Velvet Clues, as Connor, I leave you with this thought. In the end, it was not the false bells that proved deadly, but the human heart twisted by greed and fear. Miss Marple, through her patient observation and deep understanding of human nature, had once again shown that truth, like the sound of bells, will always ring out clearly for those who know how to listen. Thank you for joining us on this journey through deception and discovery, and may your own Christmas bells, whatever their provenance, ring with joy and peace.